At 9:17 a.m. on January 22nd, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George lay inside the shattered remains of a captured Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. Through the optic that his fellow officers had mocked for 6 straight weeks, he studied a massive banyan tree roughly 240 yards away. George was 27 years old. Before the war, he had been an Illinois state shooting champion. In combat, however, he had yet to record a single confirmed kill. Meanwhile, 11 Japanese snipers were operating in the groves near Point Cruz. In just 72 hours, they had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. His commanding officer dismissed George's rifle as a sporting novelty. Other platoon leaders joked that it was his mail-order sweetheart. When George first uncrated his Winchester Model 70, equipped with a Lyman Alaskan scope, and Griffin and Howe mount at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the unit armorer asked if he planned to hunt deer with it. George replied calmly that it was meant for Japanese soldiers. The irony was that the unit shipped out before the rifle even arrived. During the long voyage to Guadalcanal, George watched other soldiers meticulously clean their standard-issue M1 Garands, while his own rifle sat in a warehouse back in Illinois. He filed requests to have it forwarded through military channels. Weeks passed. In late December 1942, a supply sergeant finally handed him a wooden crate stamped "Fragile." Inside was the rifle he had purchased with 2 years of National Guard pay. The weapon weighed just over 9 pounds. The optic added several more ounces. The standard Garand carried by the rest of his battalion weighed slightly more, but offered 8 semi-automatic rounds. George's Winchester was bolt action, holding only 5 cartridges at a time. Captain Morris ordered him to leave the civilian rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry had relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal at the end of December. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had secured Henderson Field and held it under relentless pressure. But Mount Austin remained in Japanese hands, and the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River still concealed enemy positions. Mount Austin rose more than 1,500 feet above the surrounding jungle. The Japanese had fortified it with dozens of bunkers and hundreds of troops. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. 16 days of brutal fighting followed. 34 Americans were killed. 279 were wounded before the western slope was finally secured on January 2nd. Throughout that entire operation, George never fired his Winchester in combat. Point Cruz was different. There were no fixed bunkers, no entrenched defensive lines. Japanese soldiers who had withdrawn from Henderson Field had dispersed into the trees, especially the towering banyans that dominated the groves. Among them were skilled snipers armed with scoped Arisaka rifles. They knew the jungle intimately. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper shot Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. The following day, 2 more men from L Company were killed during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 additional soldiers died. One was struck through the neck from a tree the patrol had already passed twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. Japanese snipers were cutting down his men faster than disease. He needed someone who could shoot. He asked directly whether that mail-order rifle of George's could actually make a difference. George answered with credentials, not excuses. In 1939, he had won the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards, the youngest champion in state history. At 600 yards, he had fired 6-inch groups with iron sights. With the Lyman scope, he could place 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. George spent that night preparing his rifle with deliberate care. The Winchester had been packed in Cosmoline for the ocean voyage, and although he had cleaned it before, he went through the process again. He inspected the scope mounts, checked the screws, adjusted the eye relief. From a pouch, he removed 5 rounds of .30-06 hunting ammunition he had brought from Tennessee. The same cartridge the M1 Garand fired, but these were loads he trusted. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position inside the ruins of a Japanese bunker, captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy snipers were using the enormous banyan trees in that area as elevated firing platforms. Some rose nearly 90 feet into the air, with trunks thick enough to hide a man entirely. A sniper could climb before first light and remain unseen until nightfall. George brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition on stripper clips. He settled into the broken concrete and began scanning the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan offered only 2.5 power magnification. It was not impressive by modern standards, but it was enough to detect subtle movement that bare eyes would miss. The jungle never truly fell silent. Birds called overhead, insects droned, artillery rumbled somewhere in the distance. George filtered the noise and focused on motion. He scanned methodically, left to right, top to bottom. At 9:17 a.m., he saw it. A branch shifted unnaturally. There was no wind. 87 feet up in a banyan tree, 240 yards away, something had moved. George held his sight steady. The branch moved again. Then the outline emerged. A man in dark clothing positioned in a fork where 3 limbs met. The Japanese sniper faced east, watching the supply trail George's battalion used daily. George adjusted for wind. 2 clicks right. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger broke cleanly at just over 3 pounds. He had tuned it himself before the war, refining it through hours of practice. Now it would determine whether a civilian rifle could defeat a trained jungle sniper. He squeezed. The shot cracked across the grove. The recoil pressed into his shoulder. Through the scope, George saw the sniper jerk violently and tumble downward. The body fell through branches and struck the ground near the base of the tree. George cycled the bolt smoothly. The spent casing ejected. Another round slid into the chamber. He kept the crosshairs fixed on the tree, waiting. Nothing. But Japanese snipers rarely operated alone. They worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 observer. If George had eliminated the shooter, the spotter would be nearby, either in the same tree or within supporting distance. He expanded his search pattern to the surrounding banyans. The limited magnification forced him to move slowly, examining each shadow, each intersection of branch and vine. At 9:43, he found the second man. This one occupied a different tree about 60 yards north of the first. Lower, perhaps 50 feet above ground, and moving downward quickly. He had heard the shot and knew the position was compromised. George led the target slightly and fired. The second sniper fell backward off the trunk.
His rifle clattered through leaves before striking the jungle floor. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded using a stripper clip. His breathing remained controlled, his pulse steady. The mechanics were identical to competition shooting, except these targets had been hunting his friends. At 11:21, a bullet slammed into the sandbags 6 inches from George's head. Dirt sprayed into his face. He rolled to his left and flattened himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest. A 3rd sniper. George waited 3 full minutes before moving again. When he eased back into position, he scanned the southwest tree line. Any competent sniper would relocate after firing.
In dense jungle, however, relocation options were limited. At 11:38, George found him, 3rd tree from the left, in a cluster of 5 banyans, 73 feet high. The Japanese sniper had shifted branches, but remained in the same tree. A fatal mistake. George centered the crosshairs on the dark form and fired. The 3rd sniper fell without a sound. By noon, George had accounted for 5 enemy snipers. Word spread quickly through the battalion. Soldiers who had mocked his mail-order rifle now asked to watch him work. George refused. Spectators attracted attention. Attention invited fire. After the 5th kill, the Japanese adapted. Movement in daylight ceased. The remainder of the afternoon passed with George scanning empty trees. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris waited. The mockery was gone. He wanted George back at dawn. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain. Sheets of water poured through the canopy, turning the jungle floor into mud and limiting visibility to less than 100 yards. George remained inside the ruined bunker, waiting. Rain masked sound and movement. If the Japanese were disciplined, they would use it. At 8:15, the downpour weakened. By 8:45, visibility had improved enough to work. At 9:12, George located the 1st sniper of the day. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the storm. Smart. The rainfall concealed the noise of ascent. This sniper had chosen a tree nearly 290 yards away, farther than the previous day's engagements. They were adjusting to him. George compensated for the longer range, controlled his breathing, and fired. The 6th sniper fell. At 9:57, the response came. Japanese mortars began landing around the bunker. They had triangulated his position, either by muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds struck 40 yards short. The next salvo landed 20 yards closer. The third would hit. George grabbed his rifle and sprinted north along the tree line. He dove into a shell crater seconds before the bunker he had occupied disappeared in explosions and debris. He had survived by seconds. When the barrage stopped, George relocated again, this time to a fallen tree roughly 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The trunk provided concealment and an unobstructed view of the groves. He resumed scanning. The dynamic had changed. This was no longer target practice. It was a duel. At 14:23, George eliminated his 7th sniper. At 15:41, he killed the 8th. This one had climbed unusually high, 94 feet above ground. The elevation offered concealment, but when the sun shifted, the sniper's silhouette contrasted faintly against the sky. A small detail, a fatal one. At 1700, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. He had been exposed for 9 hours. 8 confirmed kills in 2 days. 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. George cleaned his rifle that night and calculated the numbers. Intelligence had estimated 11 Japanese snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead. 3 remained. Those 3 would not be careless. They had survived longer than the others. They now understood his rifle, his patience, and roughly where he operated. George slept poorly. Rain returned at 4:15 on January 24th. By 5:30, it was heavy enough to delay any immediate movement. Instead of returning to the bunker or the fallen tree, both compromised, George chose a new position 70 yards south of his previous location. The site had once been a Marine machine gun nest among a cluster of large rocks. It offered cover and overlapping fields of fire. At 7:43, the rain reduced to a drizzle. Visibility returned gradually. George began scanning. At 8:17, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned lower than usual, around 40 feet up in a palm tree 190 yards away. Most snipers preferred height for improved sight lines. This one had chosen concealment. The palm fronds formed a natural hide invisible from ground level. But George was elevated on the rocks. His angle allowed him to see downward into the leaves. He aimed, then hesitated. It felt wrong. Too obvious. Too exposed. After losing 8 men in 3 days, the remaining snipers would not make simple mistakes. This position looked like bait. George lowered his rifle and expanded his scan. If the palm sniper was a decoy, the real threat would be positioned to observe anyone engaging him, watching for muzzle flash, prepared to counterfire. George searched every tree within 300 yards of the palm, slowly, methodically. 11 minutes passed. At 8:28, he found the real danger. 80 yards northwest of the palm stood a banyan tree. 91 feet up, concealed behind layered branches and vines, a Japanese sniper lay in perfect overwatch. From that position, he had a clear line of sight to George's previous location at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to reveal himself. George faced 2 problems. First, if he shot the hidden sniper directly, the sound would disclose his true position. The sniper might relocate before George could chamber a second round. Second, if he did nothing, the sniper would eventually deduce that George was not at the fallen tree and begin searching more aggressively. George decided to reverse the trap. He aimed at the palm tree decoy and fired. The decoy jerked and fell from the tree. Immediately, George swung his rifle toward the banyan. The hidden sniper reacted to the shot, turning slightly toward the sound. That movement was enough. George fired before the sniper completed the turn. The 10th sniper fell. 2 shots. 2 kills. But now his location was exposed. George grabbed his rifle and ammunition and moved east along the rocks. He dropped into a drainage ditch roughly 40 yards away and pressed himself into the mud. At 8:34, machine gun fire tore across the rocks he had abandoned only seconds earlier. Dust and stone fragments erupted where he had been lying. The burst lasted 17 seconds. He counted to 60 before relocating again, this time to a water-filled shell crater about 100 yards east. Water reached his chest. He rested the Winchester along the crater rim and resumed scanning. 10 confirmed kills. 1 remained. The final sniper would be the most experienced. He had watched 10 comrades die over 3 days. He understood George's habits, his rifle, and the approximate areas he preferred. George scanned the jungle carefully. Through the limited magnification of the Lyman scope, distant shapes were visible but difficult to interpret. Every shadow might conceal a man. Every branch could be mistaken for a rifle barrel. At 9:47, George recognized his error. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. Movement caught his peripheral vision, low to the ground, 60 yards south of his crater. A figure was advancing through undergrowth, crawling parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper had abandoned elevation and chosen the jungle floor for concealment. George remained motionless in the water. His rifle was already shouldered, but the rim of the crater partially obstructed his view. To fire, he would need to rise slightly, exposing himself. The sniper stopped at 9:52, roughly 40 yards from the rocks George had previously used. He studied the position carefully, scanning for signs of movement. Patience defined sniper work. Waiting for the correct moment mattered more than speed. At 9:58, the sniper resumed moving, closer to the rocks. 30 yards, 25. He was sweeping along what he believed to be George's escape route. At 10:03, he entered the rock position and faced east toward the drainage ditch, where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position, but facing the wrong direction. George had a clear shot. Yet he hesitated again. This man had survived, while 10 others had failed. A veteran would not remain exposed in an obvious position for long. It could be another deception. George widened his awareness. At 10:06, he identified a second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest, concealed behind a fallen tree. This man was motionless, watching, rifle aimed toward the drainage ditch. 2 men. Whether this was support or the final pair operating together, the situation had changed. George could not eliminate both instantly with a bolt-action rifle. Each shot required cycling the bolt, time enough for retaliation. He chose patience. George lowered himself deeper into the water until only his eyes remained above the surface. He kept the rifle upright to prevent water from entering the barrel. He waited. At 10:13, the sniper in the rocks stood and signaled to his partner. After 10 minutes of observing an empty ditch, he concluded George had moved farther east. Both soldiers began sweeping eastward in parallel lines, approximately 70 yards apart. They passed George's crater. Their backs were exposed. George rose slowly from the water. Mud and droplets slid from his uniform. He aimed at the closer soldier, 42 yards away, and fired. The man collapsed instantly. George cycled the bolt and shifted to the second soldier, who was turning, raising his rifle. George fired again. The second soldier fell. 11 shots over 4 days. 11 snipers eliminated. George climbed partially out of the crater and retrieved his spent casings. Then he froze. Voices. Japanese voices approaching from the tree line. Multiple men. He dropped back into the crater and submerged once more, leaving only his eyes above the water. He held the Winchester vertically. At least 6 soldiers were approaching the bodies. These were not snipers. Infantry. The voices grew closer, branches snapping, equipment shifting. They reached the first body 42 yards away. Conversation followed. Urgent tones. Then they moved to the second. At 10:28, the voices shifted direction. Toward the crater. They had discovered his tracks, boot prints leading from the rocks to the water. George had 5 rounds remaining in the rifle. There were at least 6 enemy soldiers. Poor odds for a bolt-action rifle. The voices approached. 30 yards. 25. 20. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim and looked down. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. He cycled the bolt underwater and rose slightly. 2 more soldiers reached the rim. George fired once, worked the bolt, fired again. Both men dropped. 3 rounds remained. Shouting erupted. More soldiers were closing in. George climbed out of the crater on the north side and sprinted 20 yards to a fallen tree. Rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets struck dirt and wood around him. The Japanese were firing at sound, not confirmed targets. George remained low, scanning. 2 soldiers advanced toward the crater, 50 yards away. George fired at the lead man. He fell. 2 rounds left. Voices now approached from 2 directions, south and east. He was about to be surrounded. A bolt-action rifle would not win this. George ran north. Vines caught at his boots. Branches whipped his face. Bullets snapped past him. He ran for 90 seconds before diving into another crater, this one dry. He pressed against the dirt wall and listened. The Japanese were not pursuing immediately. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. Mud coated the stock. Water still dripped from the barrel. 2 rounds remained. His ammunition clips were back near the first crater. At 10:47, he began moving cautiously northeast toward American lines. At 11:13, he reached friendly positions and reported to Captain Morris. 11 snipers killed, 3 additional infantry during the engagement. 17 total shots fired in combat over 4 days. Captain Morris ordered him to clean the rifle and rest. The battalion would shift east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. Intelligence suggested the Japanese were preparing evacuation from Guadalcanal. George returned to his tent and immediately disassembled the Winchester. Mud had worked into the action. Water had seeped into places it should not have been. He cleaned every component carefully, running patches through the barrel until they came out spotless. Oil, cloth, patience. The rifle had survived jungle humidity, mortar blasts, and immersion in muddy water. It would be ready again. Later that afternoon, word came from regimental headquarters. The battalion commander wanted to see him. George walked in expecting reprimand. Unauthorized solo operations, excessive ammunition use, unnecessary risk. Instead, he found Captain Morris standing beside Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander. Ferry asked a single question. Could George teach others to do what he had done? George answered honestly. Yes, but it would require time, proper rifles with optics, and men who already knew how to shoot. Ferry informed him that 14 Springfield rifles equipped with unertl scopes were available, left behind by Marine units. Additionally, 40 soldiers in the regiment had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted a sniper section. George agreed on one condition. He would keep his Winchester. The request was approved. Training began January 27th. 40 men assembled at a makeshift range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. On paper, they were excellent shooters. In combat, they had no experience operating independently, concealed, making deliberate, single shots. George began with fundamentals: breathing discipline, trigger control, wind reading, patience. The Springfield rifles weighed more than both the Garand and his Winchester. Stable when supported, exhausting when unsupported. He taught them to use terrain: logs, rocks, sandbags. Jungle warfare rarely offered ideal shooting platforms. Stability had to be created. For 3 days, they fired at targets from 100 to 400 yards, stationary, moving, partially obscured by foliage. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 could reliably hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand. His job was target identification and security. After each engagement, roles could rotate. Redundancy prevented failure. On February 1st, George led 4 teams west of the Matanikau River. Intelligence reported small groups of Japanese infantry, stragglers not yet evacuated. They positioned at dawn, overlooking a resupply trail. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier appeared. Hayes, George's assigned spotter, confirmed. George fired. The soldier dropped. Over the next 6 hours, his team engaged 7 additional targets along that trail. 7 shots. 6 confirmed kills. 1 missed due to wind. The other teams reported similar results. 23 Japanese soldiers killed that day. No American casualties. Operations continued into early February. By February 9th, the sniper section had recorded 74 confirmed kills. Conservative numbers, only bodies visually verified were counted. Japanese evacuation intensified. Destroyers arrived at night to extract forces from Cape Esperance. American units pushed west to disrupt the withdrawal, but Japanese rear guards fought effectively. George's sniper teams were assigned to neutralize covering forces along evacuation routes. On February 7th, near the Tanambogo River, George was shot. A Japanese rifle round struck his left shoulder. The impact spun him to the ground. Corporal Hayes dragged him into cover and called for a corpsman. The bullet had passed through muscle without striking bone. Painful, serious, but survivable. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned and sutured the wound. He was ordered to rest for at least 3 weeks. He spent 2 weeks recovering. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The Guadalcanal campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills. 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. Colonel Ferry recommended him for the Bronze Star. But George's war was not finished. While recovering, new orders arrived from Pacific Command. Experienced jungle officers were needed for a classified operation, somewhere in Burma. George volunteered. By March, he was aboard a transport ship, heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 traveled in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman scope was wrapped carefully in oilcloth. He did not know the mission details, only that it involved deep jungle operations behind Japanese lines, long-range patrols without conventional support, a mission where precision still mattered. The transport arrived in India on April 3rd, 1943. George and roughly 200 other officers were briefed shortly after disembarking. They were to join a newly forming long-range penetration unit, 3,000 men in total. The unit had no official title yet. Informally, the men called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The unit would later be designated the 5,307th Composite Unit. But at that moment, they were simply volunteers, preparing for one of the most demanding campaigns of the war. Training began immediately in central India. The terrain was harsh, but Burma would be worse, thicker jungle, steeper hills, heavier rainfall, and an enemy intimately familiar with the environment. The concept was simple but brutal. Operate deep behind Japanese lines for extended periods without established supply chains. Move fast. Travel light. Strike quickly. Disappear before the enemy could react. George evaluated his equipment. The Winchester Model 70 had performed flawlessly on Guadalcanal, but Burma would require weeks of continuous movement. Every ounce mattered. He replaced the heavier Lyman Alaskan scope with a lighter Weaver 330. The magnification remained the same, but the reduced weight made a difference on long marches. He also modified other components, trimming unnecessary mass where possible. The adjustments reduced the rifle's weight by nearly a pound. Not dramatic, but over months of jungle travel carrying 60 pounds of gear, even small savings added up. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their objective? Advance through northern Burma and seize the Myitkyina airfield. That airfield was critical to maintaining Allied supply routes into China. Japanese forces in the region numbered around 4,000. The Marauders would not approach by road. They would march through terrain the Japanese considered impassable: mountain ridges, flooded valleys, dense jungle corridors with almost no established trails. No artillery support, no motorized transport. Supplies carried on backs or by pack mules. The march began February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Exhaustion took a toll. Malaria cases increased daily. Dysentery spread. Pack mules slipped and broke legs on steep descents. Some had to be euthanized to prevent slowing the column. By March, the battalion had traveled over 200 miles. They engaged Japanese forces repeatedly, 12 small skirmishes in quick succession. These were not set-piece battles, but ambushes and brief firefights. The Marauders were designed to harass and destabilize, not hold ground. George used his Winchester sparingly. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing men at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position threatening the column. Once at 290 yards to eliminate a sniper who had pinned down a patrol. 3 shots. 3 confirmed kills. He never fired twice from the same position. The distinctive report of his rifle differed from the Garand's. A single shot announced presence. A second would invite counterfire. Shoot and move immediately. That became instinct. The campaign lasted 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had marched more than 700 miles. Disease claimed more men than bullets: malaria, dysentery, typhus. The original force dwindled dramatically under the strain. On May 17, 1944, the Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. Strategic success, but at enormous cost. The unit was exhausted and combat ineffective. Too many sick, too many wounded. George survived. His Winchester survived. Yet during 3 months of operations, he had fired it only a handful of times. Most combat in Burma occurred at close range, 50 yards or less. Dense vegetation made long-range precision rare. George began to understand something. The Winchester Model 70 was an exceptional rifle, perhaps the finest sporting bolt action of its era. But warfare was evolving. Semi-automatic rifles like the M1 Garand were becoming standard. Firepower and speed increasingly outweighed deliberate precision in many engagements. There would be future wars, but George would not see combat again. In June 1944, the Marauders were evacuated. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never again fired his Winchester in combat. George returned to the United States in July 1944. The Army promoted him to captain and assigned him to Fort Benning, Georgia. His new responsibility was to train infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught what he had learned the hard way: how to move through jungle terrain without detection, how to read subtle environmental clues, how to take a single, deliberate shot instead of wasting ammunition. He emphasized independence, discipline, and controlled aggression. The Winchester Model 70 came with him. That rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee, across the Pacific to Guadalcanal, then onward to India and Burma, and now back to Georgia. It had accounted for at least 14 confirmed enemy snipers and additional infantry during direct engagements. George stopped keeping precise count after Burma. The rifle remained in a footlocker in his quarters. He rarely handled it. The war was shifting. The Pacific Campaign continued island by island. In Europe, Allied forces pushed deeper into France and toward Germany. The U.S. military was standardizing equipment on an industrial scale: mass production, interchangeable parts, uniform training. There was less room for privately purchased rifles and individual customization. George understood the necessity. Modern warfare demanded efficiency. But something he believed was being lost: the emphasis on individual mastery, the craftsman's approach to soldiering, the belief that a single disciplined marksman could decisively influence a battlefield. In January 1947, George left the Army as a lieutenant colonel. His decorations included 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantryman Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University under the GI Bill. He studied politics and graduated with highest honors in 1950. After Princeton, he spent 4 years at Oxford. Then 4 more years in British East Africa studying political institutions and regional governance. Eventually, George settled in Washington, D.C., becoming executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he served as a consultant and lecturer at the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute. During these years, he rarely discussed Guadalcanal or Burma publicly. Colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific. Few knew about Point Cruz. Fewer still knew about the Japanese snipers or the Winchester Model 70. In 1947, shortly after leaving active service, George began writing a detailed account of his experiences, not for fame, but for documentation. He wanted to preserve technical observations about jungle warfare, weapons, ballistics, and tactics, while the memories remained sharp. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript exceeded 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association reviewed the draft and encouraged publication. George hesitated. The text was technical, analytical, more a field manual than a memoir, but eventually he agreed. The book was published in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic among firearms historians and military scholars. The writing style was clinical. No dramatization, no glorification. Just facts. What worked, what failed, and why. His detailed descriptions of Japanese weapons and jungle tactics remain among the most precise contemporary accounts available from the Pacific Theater. The book never became a mainstream bestseller, but among serious students of military history, it earned enduring respect. George lived long enough to witness 3 additional American wars: Korea, Vietnam,
and the Gulf War. He observed the evolution of military rifles from the M1 Garand to the M14, and later to the M16. He watched sniping become a formalized military specialty, complete with dedicated schools, standardized optics, and doctrine refined through decades of combat. Many of the lessons he had learned through experience on Guadalcanal and in Burma were later institutionalized. Patience, mobility, concealment, precision, shoot and relocate. John George passed away on January 3, 2009, at the age of 90. The Winchester Model 70, that had eliminated Japanese snipers in the groves of Point Cruz, was eventually donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It rests today inside a glass display case with a small plaque summarizing its history. Most visitors walk past it without pausing.
It appears to be an ordinary vintage hunting rifle. It is not. It is the rifle that demonstrated how a disciplined marksman with civilian equipment could outperform professionally trained military snipers operating in their own terrain. It is the rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days, when an entire battalion had struggled for weeks. It is the rifle that quietly influenced American thinking about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. George never sought public recognition for those actions. He rarely told the story in interviews. His focus remained on analysis, education, and service, rather than personal glory. His legacy is not only measured in confirmed kills. It lies in the sniper section he built, men trained to operate in pairs, to think independently, to value patience over speed. It lies in the doctrine that grew from those early jungle engagements. It lies in a book written without exaggeration, preserving lessons for future generations. The broader war moved on. Technology advanced, equipment standardized, armies became larger, more industrial, more mechanized. Yet George's experience proved something fundamental. Individual skill still mattered. A single, well-placed shot, taken at the right moment, could alter the balance of a battlefield. In the museum, the rifle stands silent. To most, it is just wood and steel. To those who know the history, it represents discipline, calculation, restraint, and the quiet reality of modern combat, where survival often belongs to the patient observer, rather than the loudest weapon. John George's story is not one of spectacle. It is one of preparation meeting opportunity, of a civilian marksman who refused to leave his mail-order rifle behind, of a soldier who adapted, trained others, and carried lessons forward long after the gunfire ended. History remembers generals and massive campaigns. Sometimes, however, it turns on the decisions of a single man in a ruined bunker at 9:17 in the morning.